And I really hope everybody enjoys this session as much as we have enjoyed putting this together. One final note for people who are watching the live stream on YouTube. You can post your comments on the comment section and we'll share the link on Twitter. So please post your questions for Swanand and Pramod over there and we'll pick them up from there and take them forward. Thank you very much. Over to both of you.
Is this thing on? Okay. Cool, I'll take it. Yeah, I'll take it. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the topic or the title, falsehoods about async communications. One of my gripe is I see hot takes on Twitter, LinkedIn, and in conversations like, oh, this doesn't work for me in remote. Oh, when you're remote, this doesn't happen. Oh, when you're remote, this is not good. And my personal experience has been consistently different, right? I'll share a little bit of my journey about remote that will explain why I'm doing this talk today. But I summarized all of that into a bunch of falsehoods people believe. The allegory to this is a very famous blog post called Falsehoods Programmer Believe About Names by Patio11, a very famous blog post. If you have not read, I would say go read it. It's a, I would say, generation-defining blog post, right? And so this is a little bit on that line, and my hat tip to Patio11. Patio11, Patrick McKenzie, right?
Cool.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so a little bit about myself. So I've been working as an independent software developer contractor for the last few years, and roughly coincided with the onset of the COVID pandemic. So which meant I started out intensively, like many people, doing async and remote work. So which is when this thought started bubbling in my mind. Before that, I worked for about 15 years in various companies like Uber, Yahoo, Capillary, ThoughtWorks. So that was mostly, like either US plus India or pretty much on-site. But now I've kind of done a few years of remote work and async. So that's how the idea started, that we should probably have a session about that. Yeah.
Cool. I'm Swanand. I'm currently the CTO at CoLearn. This slide is actually a nice intro for me. I have a track record of working on things before they became cool, consistently throughout my career. We used to run AI and ML based startup which got acquired by Remax. This was 8 years ago. Fintech before it was cool. I built a credit card processor. Last mile logistics before they cooled 12 years ago at Dispatch Track. So this is my habit. Like, so if whatever I'm working on, like you can extrapolate the next time onwards. I mean, I'm working in EdTech right now. CoLearn is a search company, so perhaps EdTech will become cooler, right? And before we dive into the meat of the talk today, I wanted to share a little bit of timeline which gives some context. 2009, I was at Dispatch Track, and we were remote and sync, right? And this is the first falsehood we are going to see, where people say remote means async, right? But back in 2009, 13, 14 years ago, I was on a team that worked remotely and but we were synchronized. Then one thing happened. I became team lead in Dispatch Track, and I started running and taking charge of the consulting business, and I started running teams. And so then we became co-located and async, because all my team used to sit in the same office, right? But our mode of communication was async, right? Before this, the manager Satish Natarajan, extraordinary tech and business guy, he used to work at Microsoft. He used to run the team remotely from San Francisco, right? All of us were in India, and he used to run the team from San Francisco, completely remote. But we would sync up every day. There were daily reports. We had a ticket tracker, whatnot. So the whole communication was very synchronous. But it was still remote because everybody got their own focus time to work on. Then I became the team lead. Then we became co-located async. Then I took up a couple of jobs, Clerky, Y Combinator, Darling. I worked there for a little bit. Slimplero. This was completely remote and async, which is what most people identify when they say remote work, right? TrueBlue async work. There were 3-4 people in the team. Everybody knew what they were doing. We would sync up once in a while, but most of the communication was either email or GitHub issues or code. And then I was at Remax, where we were remote and hybrid. When I say hybrid, it was a team of seniors, so you can assume like a team sort of setting, where everybody was senior in their careers. and everybody knew what they're doing. So we had a mix culture. We would do sync when needed, we would do async when needed. We would meet frequently on off sites and whatnot. So it was a hybrid mixture. And then co-learn, we are remote plus sync again, back to my roots, where fundamentally we're a distributed team, but we do a lot of pair programming, we do a lot of stand-ups and sync. We make sure everybody gets focus time, but we are also in sync with each other. We are on Slack online. So if you can see, like, all modes are sort of covered, and which is why, like, this talk is like a part of this is condensed version of all the things I've seen, and everything is my lived experience with enough evidence of that working in other parts of the world as well. Cool. Onwards to the falsehoods.
Yep.
So, like I said, the first one, remote means async. I just want a quick show of hands, like, do you identify with this? I know I'm phrasing it as a falsehood, which means you might feel shy to raise your hand. But fundamentally, remote means async is a falsehood in my opinion. And this dominantly comes from learning from open source teams, which work in this fashion, right? And they work well, like GitHub or Git team, for example. A lot of the classic open source software is built in remote and async fashion, and it works really well for them. But open source is a very different mode of working, fundamentally a distrust based system, where you need to be very strong gatekeeper of quality. So a very different style of working. In a product team or a consulting team, our trust equation is very different. So we don't need to work like open source teams do. You can, but you don't need to.
I think one point I would make here is remote earlier used to mean you're necessarily in different time zones, but I think now with the pandemic, we were remote, but we were probably in the same time zone. So maybe that disconnect between remote and async started shrinking a bit, and we realized, yeah.
Great point. Like in my early career, like Pramod said, we were geographically distributed, which means it was very hard to find a common time for everybody to meet, right? But we still found times to meet whoever possible. Like sometimes people stayed up in the night just because they liked your teammates, and hey, if you guys are sitting and having beer together and pizza or whatnot, I'll stay up and have my tea, whatever, right? So that culture was there, but the gap has shrunk a lot after in the last 5-6 years.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that no, this is a falsehood, because you can be remote and sync, and you can be co-located and async as well, right? These two sound a little bit counterintuitive. And so I want to go a little bit into both. Remote and sync, so here what I'll do is I'll explain a little bit on how we work at co-learn, and there are a lot of other companies, we are not unique in that sense, a lot of other companies who work that way. Pivotal famously used to work similar. ThoughtWorks also for a long period had similar fashion. A lot of the premium consultants work in this fashion, like a McKinsey style or high-end consultants who charge a lot of money, who are they come in as a leadership position. Like, for example, my friend Gopal here, if Gopal were to work with a company, billing his own time, he would work somewhat of like this, at a very high level, solving higher and more difficult problems. Very common to work remote and sync, right? So in co-learn, what we do is we do a lot of pair programming. We don't do 100%, like personally, I don't like 100% pairing, but I do like pair programming a lot. And so we do pair programming, but everybody also gets focus time. But when I say sync, what that means is that generally everybody is on the same page at all times, right? And a lot of the rate of information arrival is a little bit higher, and so asynchronous mode usually means some people always get left behind, and we can't afford to have that. And so we run cadence meetings, we have stand-ups, we have a very Jira-focused workflow. So in general, everybody makes sure that everyone else is on the same page, right? And people are available to each other. They have an overlap just in case they need to work together. But fundamentally, they are distributed and they have their own working hours. Like our top front-end engineer, Gopal, for example, is an early morning person. So he likes to wake up at 5 in the morning and work. Sneha has worked with Gopal. Sneha used to be a front-end engineer at co-learn, right? So we have people who like working in morning. Some people are late night. But they make sure that there is some overlap between them. And the key aspect of remote and sync is your information sharing. Is everybody on the same page at the same time or not? In async teams, that's not always the case. Somebody might be, like let's say you're working on something like a device driver or something. You might be months into your work and nobody would know about it until you open the PR and whatnot, right? So everybody is like way behind on. In our team, we can't afford to have that. We don't, like from a business level, we don't have that kind of luxury or clarity. So which is why we chose this mode. And then co-located and async is a very interesting mode, is where everybody is at the same location, but everybody has clarity on what they're doing and they're on into their own thing. Yes, please.
So actually sync and async, that differentiation, like what is the tipping point where you say this is sync and this is async? That's kind of confusing.
Okay.
Especially in the context of
Do you want to repeat the question?
so sync and async, right?
Right.
When do you say that this is a sync communication versus this is a async communication? Like what is that tipping point? And especially the confusion stems from the point of view that some teams tend to communicate mostly through verbal methods, and then there are some teams which tend to do silent meetings or proper written communication. Like if I have to communicate my a certain analysis to you, it has to be a written document where you comment and I evolve it according to your comments.
Okay.
Now that is fundamentally an asynchronous thing, but at the same time, when you said sync and async are different, and you said, hey, you know what, you cannot be running behind me more than say 4 days.
Okay.
So you have to be updated by, everybody in the team has to be within 4 days of the latest information.
Correct.
So I think there is some additional clarity that is useful here in terms of whether written communication is used as well or not.
Okay.
And an additional dimension, I think.
Yeah, cool. Great question. The main difference is during your primary working hours, are you dependent on someone else being available for you or not? Fundamentally, that is what makes the difference between sync and async, right? Not communication, written documentation, or being on the same page. If your job involves someone else being available for you, because either you're stuck, you don't know what to do, etc., then that, and this is happening more frequently than not, then you are synchronous, right? And if not, then you are asynchronous. That is the main difference. Written communication is just a mode of communication, right? Let me also go a little bit further. In general, in any product or tech team, I can't speak for other teams, there are two types of collaborations. One is a capacity collaboration, where let's say two backend engineers are working on parallelizing work and working on the same thing. And second is a capability collaboration, front end, back end working together, product engineering, design working together. Functional collaboration, where I don't know or I can't do what you do, but we need to work together. Or let's say Pramod and I are both data engineers, but we are just splitting the work, right? So two different types of collaboration. In async mode, this collaboration is a little bit difficult because you need to share a lot of content. You are dependent on the availability of the other people, right? But this collaboration is a little bit easier because you already have a shared functional context. You already know engineering, whatever you are functioning. And so, depending on your work situation, the sync and async factor also plays to that same, like, because then you don't need someone else to be available for you for a period of time, right? So that's my distinction. I think
one point I would like to add here is, I think I've run into this problem as well, right? Like, how far apart do you want to be for how long? And which has kind of made me think a lot about what they call cadence or frequency of sync ups, right? I think that I'm sure Swanand would also have thoughts around that. Like, I think we should probably put some thought into that. Like, okay, let's say you agree we'll catch up tomorrow or like 2 days from now. Can it wait till then? And can you do with async updates till then, right? Like, so I think the cadence and the meeting frequency, it'll kind of boil over into that part of things, right? Like, how do you structure your meetings? You can't obviously have people pinging each other all the time and saying, what's the status, right? Like, yeah.
Okay, cool.
So one more question I had to Swanand here.
Yeah.
So when you say remote and sync, right?
Right.
I mean, like thinking of it as a programmer, developer types. So like, are there some tools that are there in that space which are useful that you would want to share with the audience? Like pair programming, how do you do if somebody is not?
To be honest, we don't rely on tools so much, but we do use tuple for pair programming. I love it. use it quite a bit.
Sorry, what's it called?
Tuple.
Tuple,
It's a pair
okay.
programming tool where you get on a call, but you can share your screen, keyboard,
Okay.
mouse, all of that.
Okay.
We use Tuple quite heavily.
Okay.
But it's more about protocol following as well. Like, let's say my Slack status is not available, then don't call me, right? Or my Slack status is available, then yeah, fine, ping me. Or we have etiquette like nohello.net, for example. Don't just say hi and wait. Common gripe like we all face, right? People will ping, say hello, and then nothing. Then you're supposed to guess what they want. So
I think they say don't ask to ask, just
don't
ask.
ask to ask. Great question. Like this happens in open source communities way more. People ask like, hey, any Ruby expert here? But they don't know, like they don't really tell you why do you need a Ruby expert, right? I'm sure, I think Gopal, we have spoken about this in the past. So, in my opinion, remote and sync, the tooling is mostly around etiquette to follow. But other than that, Tuple, we use Tuple, we use a tool called Know Your Team. Know Your Team is it's a fantastic, actually Know Your Team is a separate topic of discussion. It's a fantastic product. They've productized knowledge in a very nice, structured, fluid way. So I really like using Know Your Team.
Okay.
So that's the one that comes to my mind right now. I'll share my tooling after in speaker notes.
I've heard of something called Remotion, which people can apparently log in, and you're all together and you're working. You can maybe chat with each other. Or something
Cool.
like that.
I've not come across that.
Yeah. Any?
So maybe along that same lines, right? So I think this is great. We are talking about capacity planning is more harder to do async, whereas the others generally tend to, they I mean, at least some degree, if you have some discipline, it is possible.
Right.
Now, the other maybe follow-on question is, how does the experience of the engineer itself affect that as well? Can you maybe, in your experience, how did you manage that? Meaning, especially when you have young team members.
Yeah, good question.
I
Do
think
you want to
maybe
take that first?
we'll hold that and hold that thought and
I
come to
think,
it.
yeah, because we have covered it a little bit later.
Yeah, it is going to come. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Good, thanks.
So let's move. I think I want to quickly share 2 lines about co-located and async, then we'll move to the next one. Co-located and async actually has become one of my favorite styles recently. Basically, you're all working in the same location. So you do like off-work activities together. Go to lunch, tea, whatever, chai break, whatnot. But everybody has clarity on what they're working on. They're in their focus modes. And when you're working, nobody disturbs everyone else. But when you decouple from work, you come together, do things, etc. Right? So some part of your social life is also in your work life, which I was technically against all my career. But in the last 4 or 5 years, somehow after pandemic, I've come to appreciate it a little more. So that mode where people, when they're working, they don't need each other. But off work, when you decouple, you do need each other, right? So that mode of co-located async works for some team. Like, especially, I think a lot of consulting teams work in this fashion. Gopal, if you haven't, yeah.
No, this is exactly what we do, co-located and async. And it works well, I'll say mostly co-located, may not be literally every day, but say over 50% co-located and almost entirely async. I think it's even more important when your team structure is where there's a heavy dependence on a small number of people. You can't afford to be sync, otherwise the whole company comes to a halt.
Correct.
So you have to plan, you have to make sure that people are able to function without, for example, I'm sitting here now. If I had 40 people waiting on me to answer 55 things in Slack, it's ridiculous, right?
Correct.
So it comes down to what steps can you take today to make sure, even if you're failing today, 3 months from now, how do you fix it? So to me, this is by far the optimum that I've found so far.
Makes sense. It ties with Amul's question of where is the boundary between sync and async, and the dependency is the boundary, basically.
I don't know, somehow it relates to the bus factor also.
Potentially, yeah.
I think
okay, cool. So let's move. Next one, this is a fast one. Async means 100% async and sync means 100% sync. This is a major falsehood. When I present it like this, you're going to see, Swanand, what are you saying? Like, this is obvious, right? But no, it's not obvious. This falsehood is one of the primary reasons for people to not try remote work in the first place. People have this false notion, oh, if I do async, this is going to happen. Oh, if I do fully, and long-time remote workers have this problem, right? Oh, if we go sync, I will run into this issue. The thing is, no, you're not going to run into this issue, right? It depends a lot on the people. As we'll figure out, the central thing with remote work is the people you work with and some of those themes will come a little bit later in the talk. But this is not true. You don't really have to always be async, right? Yeah, fine. Like on a Friday evening, everybody catch up, right? What works for you, whatever. Like you take the call. You don't have to always work in this mode, but don't let that stop you from trying the other things out, right? Yes, please.
Actually, I think now that you make me look at it this way, I think the Basecamp async communication guide kind of seems like a bad label. Like their whole thing around, hey, async communication means that you are doing everything in written form, right? That has created that wrong image in my head.
Okay, so just repeat for question for everybody. Amol is saying that the Basecamp or even the GitLab guide for async communication has sort of created this. I would say they are on the extreme side of the spectrum. It's a spectrum. If let's say 0 to 100, they are on the extreme side of the spectrum where they work fully async. It works in a business where there's a lot of clarity, right?
Right.
But when there is not enough business clarity, I have personally found it very challenging to be 100% asynchronous.
Right. I think one point I would say to be aware of this spectrum is because you'll have to adapt it to your company's circumstances, right? Like your business model, your deployment model, and your customer support model, right? Like, and your development software methodology. I think what we can say is this is how to think about it. These are the range of possibilities and options, and you have to choose from them to fit your needs. Right,
and follow like my unsolicited advice is follow the capability versus capacity collaboration duality. If you need more of which do you need more of, and then that can guide how much and which mode is going to work. You can sort of predict which one is going to work for you. Next, so I had this tweet. I want to quickly share this. Basically, it's a graph. On the top is asynchronous, so you can say 100% asynchronous at the top, and 100% synchronous at the bottom, and then middle is say 0%, and on the right 100% distributed, is like everybody in different time zones and whatnot, and then on the left is like everybody in the same office co-located, right? So this whole async sync, this graph sort of covers a lot of my thoughts that you can be anywhere in this matrix, right? With varying degrees of what style works for you. One quick, I'll not go too deep into it, I'll share the tweet separately. But for example, when you're distributed and asynchronous, your open source teams, for example, a lot of deep work and solitude is automatically possible because you fundamentally everybody understands what they're doing, you can go deep down, whatever. If you're building a new device driver, you don't want anybody bothering you for a month, right? You just fully immersed in that. So that kind of work is definitely possible here. But deep work is also possible when you're co-located and asynchronous, which is what I shared earlier, right? It's possible, right? Don't think that, okay, only this quadrant deep work makes possible, right? And then there are, for example, if you're co-located and also a little bit on the synchronous side, there's this thing I call as death by meetings. I'm sure everybody has experienced it, right? Too many meetings. Basically, my hypothesis is that every organization has more meetings than it needs. 100%. Every single organ in the world has more meetings than they need. And there's nothing we can do about it.
It's like Swanand's version of Parkinson's law or something like that, right? Like
something like
work
that.
takes up all time available
Right.
for completion. Like
Yeah, exactly.
Like that.
Same with in my deep work talk, like I've mentioned this thing called tap on the shoulder disease. It happens a lot with co-located teams. It's very tempting to go and just bother somebody when you need them without thinking about them, because obviously who thinks about other people all the time? You are always about what you need at the moment, and in that moment, if the protocol is not established, we end up crossing these boundaries. And it happens a lot in the co-located scenario. Does not happen in distributed, because obviously what are you going to do? Like call me on Slack. If I'm on D&D, I'm not going to see your calls, right? So it's possible to decouple yourself. So anyway, so that was my, I wanted to show this to present the idea that this is a spectrum and actually a quadrant, and it's not a binary thing. Yes, please. Taz has a question.
Hey, so I was just going through the lists of also currently on the first one, right?
Second.
It's called remote means sync.
Yeah.
Would it be accurate if I modify the statement to remote, the falsehood as remote means sync only?
Yeah.
Is that what you're trying to do?
Yeah, that's what it means. Yeah, it's just a pithy version of the same thing. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Cool. All right. So let's move to the next one.
I was curious about one point there.
Okay. Sure.
So, so one question I have is like, why would somebody be co-located and asynchronous when you look at that, right?
Yeah.
The general idea is, hey, because I'm dependent on my team, that's why I want to be co-located, right?
I think Gopal just explained. No, yeah. Actually, can we do this offline? Because I think Gopal explained it.
Sure.
Maybe in a break or something, we can have a more nuanced discussion.
No
about
worries, no worries.
Yeah? Because I think he did explain it. So I'm not shooting you down, but we can table it. Cool. Okay, next one. This is my favorite. First spicy take. High fidelity communication makes all the difference. I see this everywhere. People say, oh, but if you're remote, it's just not the same. It's just not the same. Video is not the same. Whatnot. My fundamental claim is high fidelity communication is not that important, right? It seems like something, oh, you know what, it's nice to have, but it's not pivotal to knowledge work, right? What I'm claiming is no, high fidelity communication is not the magic, clarity is the magic, right? If you're using high fidelity as a means to achieve clarity, mostly that's what people mean. What they mean is that, hey, we need that clarity. And they are using high fidelity communication as a crutch to achieve that clarity, right? Again, slightly salty claim. And Pramod, any thoughts?
Yeah. The way I look at it is like people probably start figuring out why something didn't work. See, the way I look at it, if everything is going fine, nobody is going to point and say communication was the problem or this or that, right? Like if things start failing, like this whole aspect that there is remote involved, there is async involved, and then communication starts being looked at. But it need not be the problem necessarily, I think.
Live without high fidelity communication, and remote has famously been a bad fit in the very early. It's not that people haven't pulled off. Indie developers and a lot of teams I know have pulled off startups all remotely, especially in pandemic. Like, people are very resourceful, right?
High fidelity means, like, I'm not able to visualize that.
Oh, like what we're having now, like, you know, sitting.
I think high fidelity maybe technical definition would be exactly what is in the mind of the person communicating. That exact information and emotion, you know, is replicated here. I mean, that's like a simple way of looking at it, right?
Large majority.
What gets lost in transmission would be low fidelity, right? Like that.
Large majority of people are not good at articulation.
I think
Articulation
I'll just try to get this
is
back
a
on.
rare skill. It needs to be acquired over time with feedback, right? And so when you are not articulate, obviously that fidelity matters, because then you can let people know in different ways and whatnot. Like, you are exasperated, but you can't show your exasperation in a Google Doc very easily. You can, but not very easily, right? Choice of words, etc. So that's what I mean by high fidelity. Like, you have different modes of communication available to you. Like, for example, we are talking and I feel like drawing something, I'll just draw a diagram and show you right then, right? And it's much easier done in person than say remotely, right? So what I'm saying is, we give way too much importance to high fidelity communication. We need it, but we don't need it all the time, and we don't need it as much as we think we do, right? With the caveat that founding stages of the startup, I at least personally speaking, I find it very hard in those days, even though I have a long history of working remotely, and I'm fairly articulate when it comes to business communication. But even for me, like, I've found it challenging in those stages, right? But like I said, there are people who have pulled off. Basecamp is a great example. Jason and DHS were not in the same place, and they built Basecamp remotely, right?
In the fidelity versus clarity axis,
Right.
I think it would be helpful to get a few commercial examples as well. For instance, automatic GitLab, because you open with Basecamp.
Correct. Yeah. So Automatic and Basecamp are brothers in arms, I would say. Like, they fairly also like pivotal in their product and consulting days. What else? Atlassian works. They do like frequent meetups, so they are on the high fidelity side. What else? A lot of the design startups I know, for whatever, like, maybe it's artistic reasons or not, a lot of design startups I know, they work in the high fidelity mode.
I think I would probably even look at them as orthogonal, right? Like, clarity is maybe like simplistically knowing what has to be done or what is the state of affairs, right? Like, just dumping everything you know into another person's brain may not necessarily lead to that, right? Like, you might have to
correct.
see through that information and see what's going on. Maybe you need somebody, some other expert to jump in and, drive the required clarity, right? Like,
Airbnb
or maybe a sense of perspective. So, yeah, I think that's probably what he's trying to get at. Like, focusing on high fidelity communication per se, right, is kind of orthogonal to actually attaining clarity on the thing.
How does this relate to, let's say, as you were saying, right, signing or emotional balance of what I'm trying to say? Why is it urgent to me? So
Right.
obviously, fidelity is useful to people who are not articulate.
Right.
But how do people who are not articulate then cope up? Like, for instance, if they are in a setup which is low fidelity.
I think that's a great question. Do you
Yeah.
want to take it along with the non-verbal cues?
Yeah, we'll come to
I
that.
think we are about to
there's-
get into that.
Yeah, we'll get into that because it is an important aspect of this communication or this topic. We'll come there. Okay, next. So we are here. So next spicy take. It's a falsehood. Non-verbal cues are important. This is a falsehood in my opinion. People talk about non-verbal cues all the time, saying, "Oh, you know what? But if you're on a call, I can't see your tone. I can't see. If you are writing a doc, I can't see your tone and all." Does it matter? What I'm claiming is, it's not that important in most contexts. There are certain contexts where it is important. I will come to that. But heavy reliance on non-verbal cues generally signals cultural and process issues. That you don't have an articulated process, you don't have an articulated culture, or you don't have a well-defined process. Generally, this is a very dominant pattern. I'm not making this up. I've seen this in the wild. People who generally very top-heavy teams where the leader says, "This is East, and you walk what I do, you do what I tell." And top-down heavy teams, you will see a lot of non-verbal cues, etc. There's also some trust and other undercurrents to non-verbal cues, which again I'm not an expert on trust. I'm not a researcher on that topic, so I'll not go deep into that. But there's a lot of undercurrents to non-verbal cues, which indicate process and people issues rather than the communication and work issues themselves. Which is why my claim is that if you find yourself relying too heavily on non-verbal cues, something else is wrong, right? And you need to go and figure out what is that something else.
I think I agree with the last part, especially like the heavy part I would really underline, because you want the team to be able to succeed, right? Like, and then telling them that you will only succeed if you're able to see what is not even being said. You're putting yourself in a very tough spot, right? Like, if you're a leader, you want to make sure you set up a team for success, right? Like, maybe you communicate, blah, blah, blah. The words themselves should convey enough meaning and emotion to get things done and to succeed. Of course, like maybe Swanand said, there are contexts, like obviously there are contexts where people are not going to say and they're going to phrase it this way, that way. I mean, at maybe really high levels of leadership, you have to do that, or maybe if you're talking to a customer, you have to do that, right? Like there are contexts where nobody is going to, explicitly say what you want. But within the team, I think you need that. I mean, the other thing they say, right? Disagree and commit. It's fine. Like, don't hide your disagreement. Say, I don't agree, but this is where we disagree, but we have to move forward. Let's pick some direction and move forward. I think that heavy part I would really underline. Like if you are saying we are failing because of non-verbal cues, I think that's like a really bad place to be in any way.
One-on-ones are a great example. Like one-on-ones are where I would say sometimes non-verbal cues are very important, because things that you don't want to articulate in a document, but you want to have a no-holds-barred kind of chat like outside. And sometimes that can happen on video or Zoom, but sometimes it happens better when you go have tea together, or coffee together or something, right? So one-on-ones are great examples where non-verbal cues can be important. But again, like for example, in my own team, few people are extremely articulate, and we have great one-on-ones asynchronously, right? People share notes in advance, etc. And then we respond, and then we have a 10-15 minute quick catch up on the notes, and it works out, right? Again, selection bias, but I'm saying these patterns exist, and I'm seeing them in other teams as well. Shall we move?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Is this working?
If not, I'll repeat it for everyone.
Yeah.
Is this working now?
Yes.
Non-verbal cues. The spicy hot take thing. How many people over here agree with that statement?
Yeah.
I guess
The hot take, basically.
Non-verbal cues. So I'm claiming non-verbal cues are not important.
Yeah.
So do we agree?
Yeah. I was just curious about this.
Okay.
Depends. So which part, like not important or are important?
Not important.
Now, do you agree with Swanand basically?
Yeah.
I think the same thing, the heavy part, underlining is.
Okay.
Be-
Okay. See, the thing is, now I've convinced people. So.
yeah. Because what I would argue is, this is a very textbook situation. Yeah, in an ideal team, non-verbal cues are not important. But in every other aspect, they probably play some part. Maybe 10%, maybe 5%.
Yeah.
But they play some part.
Sure.
Discarding it completely. I
No,
mean,
but I'm not saying discard I'm saying they're not as important as you think.
I think that the heavy reliance on those.
are not important.
Because
it just got to me, that's
there
all.
is a lot of FUD around moving to async and written communication because of missing out on non-verbal cues, which is what I'm attacking. Right? I'm not saying in a one-on-one don't have a no-holds-barred conversation.
And
What
also, one thing to add is that there is no set grammar to non-verbal cues, and especially when you have geographically distributed teams, even if it's within India, right? Like a person from a different corner of the country, their cues it's going to be completely different from somewhere else.
Exactly.
So if you overly rely on that, you are entirely screwing the dynamics.
Correct.
up.
If you have a mixed culture, geographically distributed
And
teams.
Let's say if I was
Distributed
working
across
with,
continents, it absolutely doesn't work because this guy from Sweden and Japan doesn't talk and behave like us.
Yeah.
So it absolutely
yeah, that's
doesn't
what I was
scale.
trying to get to.
Correct. Right. So and written communication is a great cure for some of these things because then you are completely moving past all of these accents, shared culture, all of these issues. If you have worked in a geography, like I think Joy has worked in distributed teams, so he knows. If you have worked in a geographically distributed team with multiple, you would know immediately that this doesn't play an important part, right? So anyway, I think Gopal had a different point.
Yeah, slightly different perspective. I think it's again dependent on the culture, not of your company, but of the country of the person that they come from.
does,
For
it does.
example, how many of you have been in a maths class at age 8, 10, 12 where you know more than the teacher and they make a mistake on the board?
I think
You say you're wrong and they say, shut up and sit, I'm the teacher, I know better.
I'm sure. I think
Right?
there's
It
a
happened
bunch
to
of
every
us-
one of us pretty much.
Yeah.
We've had 18, 21 years of that happening to us.
Correct.
Taking somebody from that environment and telling them tomorrow you show up in the work and your CEO tells you something and you think he's an idiot and you just say that, it's not going to happen.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. Internalized
I'm
issues.
telling you practically it doesn't happen. Right? Test it out if you want, but if you sample 100 people, maybe, but if you sample 100 people, I'd venture 95 of them will just shut up and do what you say, even if they think you're a moron.
But agree. But it takes 2 to 3 months of
Exactly.
training and working in a good environment
Yeah.
to get past that.
Exactly. It's a deliberate effort that the leadership team has to make to encourage
Correct.
that. The other thing about cross geography and cultures again, it's a joke at this point where you ask an Indian programmer do this and they say this thing, right? Like what the hell does that even mean,
the
right?
head roll.
You never say no to a customer and all these types of things. These are memes, but they're also true in some way.
Correct.
So you do need some level of it, but yeah, if you're saying without this I'm going to fall apart, yeah, that's obviously not going
Correct.
to work.
And honestly, the cultural difference is what makes it interesting. Like, if you're an Indian and whatever Indianness means to you, it's you. Like you gotta be like. I tell this to people when I read their resume. When I read your resume, I don't want to see backend engineer. I want to see Gaurav Chaturvedi, right? Your personality should show. Same with work. Like, you bring your whole personality to work. Like, don't be like some SDE3 in a random team. Like, you need to be who you are. And it's important to be like, if you're Chinese, then be Chinese, whatever that means to you. Because there is no single definition of Indian, Chinese, whatever. But that cultural variance and diversity, I think it makes, I personally really look forward to that, an important part of work, which is why I feel like teams need to get over this really fast, right?
I think one thing I would like to add here is, I think we are making this hard distinction between verbal and writing, right? Like, I kind of feel that maybe that's just not the whole world. We can probably send an audio message or something, a video message. I mean, I have not done too much of it, but I think that's a perfectly valid way of working. So what I'm saying is, like, let's not fetishize writing documents too much. Like, there's just one way, one channel of async communication. You can just record the message and send it. And then the tone obviously will carry, right? The tone and emotion will be there when you tell someone, hey, I don't think this is like a great idea. Can you think about it? The tone will come through.
Loom
right?
is a great example. Loom, I think one of the tools I mentioned.
Right.
Loom, like we use Loom a lot. Like, phenomenal. Like, very, in hindsight, it looks so similar. Oh, just record your face and record your screen and send it. And now in hindsight, it looks like a simple product, but it took them a lot of thinking to come up with that, right? And it's a great product, it works.
Right. I mean, one example I've seen of that is people doing code walkthroughs, right? They might have done a huge PR. Then your option is, do I write like a one-pager explaining each thing, or shall I just load it up in the IDE and say, this is what it is, don't pay too much attention to this. See, it's much easier for you to create. Probably the emotion carries enough, and it's it's good enough for somebody on the consumption side.
Correct. I think PRs are a great example because code review follows thought, right? And a GitHub diff is not going to ever be able to explain your thought. Right. So get on a call, get the code locally, sit next to each other if you want, but have that high context, high fidelity communication. Let's say for PR reviews, right?
So there's one more point here.
We have 4 more falsehoods to go, but
I just feel that it is about which phase of communication you are in with your teammates, right?
Okay.
So if you are in a phase of communication where there's adequate trust established, then actually you don't think a lot about the non-verbal cues.
Okay. Why do you want to work in a team where there is not adequate trust?
No, I think the phase, they've not yet reached
So,
there.
Not
for
reached
example, I just moved to a new team and I started
Yeah.
dealing with a new director of engineering. And first 1 month, we both were very careful of our expressions and what we were saying.
Correct.
And now in the middle of the calls during Slack, we can be telling each other, hey, shut up for 2 minutes, let's listen to him, right?
Correct.
And that's because there's so much mutual trust as, strategy pairing people, that we don't care too much about being misunderstood. And I think that's where the non-verbal cue thing, what you said, hits me, because it tells me that if you're not dependent on non-verbal cues, it means you have reached that phase of adequate trust.
Correct.
So that's how I interpret
it. It also connects back to the 100% and being a spectrum part, where maybe in the early days you might want to sit and work from a cafe together, right? Then go back and do your be on your way. All right, let's move. All right, my favorite. This is actually one of my top favorite. Async comms wipe out serendipity from communication or serendipity from work. This is a falsehood. People believe this all the time, and I hear this like a lot. So I want to ask everybody who agrees, who disagrees with, who thinks serendipity, async comms do wipe out serendipity, right? Or remote teams wipe out serendipity. Who agrees? Okay. Can we launch the poll for online, Amog? We launched? Okay.
Yeah, let's see.
So whoever raise your hand, please raise your hand. Make a fist. Please make a fist. Humor me. Keep one hand raised. Okay. How many Reddit users here? Keep your hands up. Keep your hands up. How many Reddit users here? If you're a Reddit user, raise your other hand. Okay. Now, are you seriously telling me the most serendipitous platform of the world, which runs asynchronously, makes you believe written communication wipes out serendipity from the work? Like I don't believe you. Right?
Did you manage to convert any of you?
No. So it's because you've not worked with me. So anyway.
Very careful.
Yeah.
The company, right? They have to be really careful.
Yeah.
I was saying that I think this is a thin line, and the company has to be really careful to make sure that this does not happen, because they have to ensure that you can have off the cuff conversations and things like that.
Okay.
That is what I feel.
Sure, there is an element of serendipity that happens offline, right? But there is a 10x more element of serendipity that happens online. Just look at the world pre-internet and post-internet. Like 90% of the post-internet world is serendipitous, right? Because some geek somewhere does a project in their basement and decides to share it. Shobit discovers something on Web3, decides to make a video. Some random person posts it on Twitter and you discover it. Is that not serendipity? Like Reddit, like the most random platform in the world. You browse there 10 minutes, you will find 10 other things, and you discover so many things. There are different forms of serendipity.
I think
the piece which the reason I believe is that this is not probably true is because in large organizations, like for example the one I'm working in, you don't have the incentive to connect with somebody, without any reason.
I
or
don't agree.
discover their thoughts. And when we do these hallway meetups, right, because I just came across and said hi, right, or the very fact that I came to this particular meetup, it creates so many opportunities that could not have happened in an online world.
Yeah, because you don't go to meetups, bro. Like,
Which is one way of saying
Yeah.
that. But inside the company, for example, we don't have those incentives.
so I see what you're saying. What I'm going to add to that is that usually this happens when reliance on the same company giving you everything, same team giving you everything is very high. If you're dependent on your team to be your social mixer, your serendipity, your discovery mechanism, all of that, then you are in for a soup. Like, then you better work at Google or something where like there are 10,000 other people and then the probability plays in your favor, right? If you're a startup with 8 people and you depend on those 8 people for everything, practically married to them in whatever sense of the word, you are in for a shockingly bad experience, right? A lot of my work career, I worked with remote teams, but the serendipity I got from meetups, conferences, right? So I'm not saying that offline wipes out serendipity. What I'm saying is relying it on work and synchronous or being co-located with work colleagues is a very suboptimal strategy, right? It's not. It's non-zero. Sure, there is serendipity when you're all in the same place. I'm not denying that, but if you're relying on that, it's very suboptimal. There is a whole world of nerds out there, ham radio, Dungeons and Dragons clubs, Toastmaster clubs, where a lot of these conversations happen. Nerds are way more serendipitous than normies, right?
I think
fight me on that.
I think we have
yes,
one
I think
comment
Shobit,
from there. And
Shobit had his raised hand for a while.
Sure.
So actually, I had read about this somewhere else as well. The term that they had used was something I liked, which was called thoughtful serendipity.
Right.
Which is like you
I
get
love
the
it.
chance to actually think about what was written or what was said,
Yeah.
and then you get to like thoughtfully add something to it,
I love the term. Like,
and that gives like better signal to noise ratio.
correct. 100% agree. Like, I think great term. I'm going to add it to my arsenal, thoughtful serendipity. It increases 10x, 20x in a remote world because people are more thoughtful of what we have. Like, everybody has channels like, coffee things, football things, whatever, Netflix things or Marvel things in their Slack, right? The chances of you discovering something meaningful to you in those channels way higher than any hallway meeting, right? Doesn't mean that nothing will happen in the hallway meeting, right? Obviously. Yeah, Suraj, you had.
So I somewhat agree with you that like it doesn't wipe out serendipity, but I also disagree because there are some things that you can say on Reddit because you are anonymous, right?
Sure, sure.
But when you're working, your name is attached to it, and there are some things that you don't want to write out because they'll end up in a court proceeding in future if you put it in a workplace Slack or email. So there is a filter that gets placed, right?
Yeah. I call it the TMI spectrum.
Yeah.
Like, too much information, bro. Like, like that happens in a workplace. I agree. But again, some of that indicates deeper, different issues, right? 21 years of school culture, you can't just wipe out. Conditioning, you can't wipe out. So some of those are different issues which surface, right?
I think I would maybe make one distinction here in serendipity itself, right? Serendipity is basically something accidental which turns out into something good, right? Like, I would say there is work-related serendipity or maybe, task or deliverable-related serendipity versus culture and, long-term human aspects, right? I mean, and obviously by definition, serendipity is you can't measure if it's lost or if it's there, right? That's pretty much what you call serendipity. And I think work-related serendipity, I think, will get affected because of remote, because I think even recently in a conference, I heard a founder say, like I have my team sitting there and somebody is like, going like this, then person behind him will, maybe knock and say like what's, or maybe, as you said, the hallway thing, right? Like you calling somebody for lunch and then you notice they're, struggling somewhere and you can say, oh, this I know, let me help you before we go for lunch. I think that is the work-related serendipity which may take a hit, but in either case, we have to keep it, I think maybe what Swanand was referring to was human connections and things like that, like serendipitous. I think you have to look at it distinctly and say how much of that is getting impacted by whatever you do and how do you account for that.
Correct. I think what Pramod was saying by work-related serendipity was bad documentation and bad org design.
Sure.
Swanand, one thing.
Yes.
I think at this point our sample space is too diluted, right? What we need to investigate is that for the specific communication inside a org, does async make that particular communication more serendipitous or not? Instead of like we are doing too many things right now.
Correct.
Like if I am to tell you, or you are to tell me, let's say that Joy, I need this particular thing by a certain day.
Correct.
Would talking to me directly help more? Would that be more serendipitous, or writing on Slack or in a document assigning the task to me? Like, I think that should be our way to measure which is good or bad rather
Correct.
than
Yeah,
sort of.
architecture discussions or whiteboarding is a great example of that. I think before I go there, somebody, yes.
So I think maybe serendipity with respect to async, I think, at least for me, is not a big problem.
Okay.
The bigger problem is remote and serendipity.
Okay. Okay.
So repeating, serendipity is not as much an issue with async as much as it is remote and serendipity. And serendipity in a particular definition.
Right.
So I think the thoughtful serendipity is wonderful, and I think I also really subscribe to that. But I think particularly for younger people, junior folks, osmosis is a big issue. And I think that kind of serendipity is, it is possible. For example, I think I've learned a lot of stuff from open source and Reddit and whatnot, right? But it took many years for me to learn that. I want my team to get it much, much faster. And it's very hard to write every one of them, to document every one of them. I'm not sure if that is really feasible either. So, yeah.
Yeah. Sneha is here. I would probably ask her, like, Sneha, how was your experience leveling up when we were all working together? Like, would you like to share anything? Mentorship, leveling up?
I think there's a mic over there.
I don't want to put you on spot. If you don't want to answer, it's fine.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So even though we were all remote, and I think I only met once, the team only once, the kind of connection that I see with the people, like Swanand came here now to Bangalore, right? Even though it's been 1 year, I made sure that I come meet him over here. So that's the kind of connection I think we were able to build. Swanand was able to build at CoLearn. As Swanand mentioned, the different channels that we have. I discovered like people doing different things, like scuba diving probably, and coffee conversations within the channels that we had. I think those kind of things, the leadership I feel should make sure that these are in place. Only then I think, I think the serendipity will happen. But otherwise, I feel it will take a hit.
Correct.
I'm also
Right?
on that point.
And there is a point on mentorship, which is why I'm not going deeper into it. Mentorship is one of the things I'm covering. But like I said, a lot of the problems that co-located, distributed bring, sync and async can wipe, right? So many of the mentorship problems that co-location solves and distributed makes it harder, sync can make them easier, right? So, and we'll see some of that later. Yes, please.
So I think when I raised my hand, I specifically want to talk about cross-pollination of ideas between teams.
Okay.
So I think within engineering, within mentorship, I think I agree with most of that serendipity being intentional.
Right.
But how do you bring cross-pollination between teams, for instance? Because that is where I feel like that hallway conversations end up leading to, like, say, a experiment being run between, say, a designer and an engineer, or a product or a designer, right?
No, I agree with you. And in some sense, you cannot 100% replicate what you have in co-location with what you have in distributed. And that's not the goal, right? For example, we are an edtech company. If we try to replicate the offline experience to online, we are going to utterly fail, because it's not the same having a teacher in a classroom versus a teacher teaching on Zoom. So in some sense, there is an overlap, but there's also a difference. And part of those things can also be taken care of by, for example, special interest groups within the team, functional excellence, or basically the matrix org, what they call it. You have business units and you have horizontal units. And then there is a lot of intentional conversation that happens between these units, right? So a lot of the org maturity can account for these things. Of course, in the founding days of a startup, all of these rules are like sort of not applicable, because there is so much chaos there that chaos is very hard to navigate, right? In any situation. And so the founding days of startup, obviously some of these rules honestly don't apply first few months because of that factor where 10 people have 10 different ideas, or let's say 3 co-founders, everybody wants to do something else. So I will qualify those 3-4 months out of this conversation. But other than that, a lot of that can be fixed by having a reasonably good org structure and having like these topical discussions. What happens is, because we have never thought about these things in a structured way, we give too much importance to randomness, right? But when you start deliberately doing things and put a little bit of structure, things fall in place automatically, right? So a lot of the loss that you are feeling is because potentially that the org or whatever, wherever you are, nobody has taken the time to painfully set it up, right? Which is the job of leaders in any team that wants to be distributed.
I think one, oh, sorry, Amit, go ahead.
Also depends on like how big the org is, right? Because if a org is say 100 people also, you can still manage all the channels and have Slack a big product. There are like 1,000 people.
Got it. But the thing is, even if the org is big, teams are still small, right? Teams are almost everywhere in the world. Teams are of the same size, roughly speaking, right? Google is whatever 100,000 people, but it's not a 100,000 people team. There are still like smaller teams within Google.
No,
so you can scale it up by team, vertical, whatever. Right?
That like about async and the serendipity, right? After one point, whenever we, at least I'm a bit hardwired thinking of async as Slack threads, right? So when you say, oh, serendipity and async, I'm like, okay, I never go, like, unless I'm tagged, I'd never go into Slack threads and try to find some new information. And the other thing about serendipity, what immediately comes to mind is somebody basically, just having a conversation, a question and answer, like, Socratic method. That's how you basically, find new information, discovery, and that aha moment of serendipity. So do you think it's like async is like, serendipity is not necessary and async can also...
No, so my claim is that good habits bring a lot more serendipity than random communication or random encounters do. I'm going to digress a little bit and dole out a little unsolicited advice. Let's say you have 40 hours of, I think I've given this advice to Raghav before. Hey Raghav. So let's say you are working 40 hours in a week, standard whatever steam engine days, 40 hours work week, right? We are stuck with 40-hour work week. Out of those 40, like 5 hours you spend on meta things, like browse Slack threads, browse your GitHub, look at Jira, look at other projects on Jira, etc., or look at your own team documentation, etc. Rest 35 hours, like do what your business demands. That's that little bit slack in the system, 1/8 of the time, is what is going to give you a lot of these other things. If you're all your time is going into only doing like what the topmost Jira card is, like I call that state as Jira card pushers, right? Like if there are people from other functions, I apologize, I don't know the correct terms for non-tech teams, but for product engineering teams, like the last thing you want to be is a Jira card pusher, where you just look at the topmost priority, just put it in your name and start working on it. If you don't have that little bit of slack in the system, where you allow yourself to deliberately do other things, then you are going to experience all that loss of serendipity, loss of connection, all of that. Yes, please.
I'll give an example here. Since PhonePe emerged out of Flipkart, so don't you think serendipity played a very important role here?
I honestly, I'm not the right person. Like I don't know I don't know that whole story. So perhaps I'm not the right person to answer. Does anybody know this story? Anybody? Okay.
Like people came together, they gathered the idea and then worked on it, and they were from the same team from what I have.
Yeah, so I guess...
Actually, this is a counter example because they met at work and then they had to be acquired by Flipkart. So this is like, okay, serendipity means Flipkart has to pay more money for it.
No, but that's what I'm saying. Like offline does
but,
not...
But I think it kind of ties into the cross-pollination thing somebody mentioned, right? Like one person in one function might realize something's off, then somebody in the same company in another function might realize it can be solved. Probably then you create a cross-functional team, then you decide you might want to create a startup. I mean, I don't know how
Correct.
that played out.
Yeah, which is why I'm saying that don't equate offline means no serendipity or... Because, for example, the React, Jordan Walkie, when he wrote React, right, a bunch of juniors used to sit across the table from him. Imagine the amount of context and awesomeness they were exposed to just by being virtue of being in the same table, right? So, of course, you can't take those things away, right? And if you have the opportunity to do those things, like, great. But what I'm saying is, like, those are like 1 in a million kind of examples, and we attribute so much to the fooled by randomness. We attribute so much to that random encounter that we forget to put a system in place where you can make it happen habitually, right? So that is my main point. Right?
I think regarding the system...
Agency, right? That mindset of agency
Correct.
is what you are, saying that, hey, have some agency. Without this also you can get it solved.
Exactly.
I think regarding the system, what I would say that I have seen from good leadership is that if you have a culture of transparency by default, right? Like everybody sends broadcast messages. I mean, it doesn't mean they spam you, but if you want to go look, you can look, right? Like maybe broadcast your daily status update or whatever it is, right? Like if you are transparent by default, then you don't have to create this elaborate system for serendipity, because somebody might, and it requires that little bit of buffer time for someone to go check. I think the other part that happens is, let's say if you are maybe 10 or 15 or a small company, serendipity might help. If you are 200 people, what are the odds that, like, somebody in this corner, exactly will help you out because you happen to be, again, if you are 200 people, then you are again back to formally asking for help or relying on this broadcast mechanism, right? So serendipity only maybe helps you in that little small sweet spot. Once you are much bigger, it's not going to help anyway.
Correct. Yeah. Yes, please.
Unsolicited advice, you have 15 minutes left.
I know, thank you so much.
No, very much required.
That is
Thank you.
solicited. Okay, okay, last few. Then I want to at least open for other questions outside of the domain of the talk today. Written is complex, written is slow. I can work so fast if I can just get on a call. Any product managers here? Or sales? Anyway, but this is a common sentiment amongst also leadership of the teams. Often, like I have also been guilty of this. I'm not saying I'm like 100% against it or whatnot. This is a falsehood. Clearly, I think it looks like a lot of people agree on this, because the main thing is thinking is what brings progress, right? In knowledge work, how deep and meaningfully you are able to think and research makes all the difference, right? Just getting in that call temporary might have a temporary pain relief and whatnot, but it's not going to make a meaningful difference long term. You are not going to reach PMA by getting on calls. You are going to reach PMA by iterating like 20 times at a blazing fast speed, somebody really thinking out of the box, right? And so, which is why I made that statement earlier that people, like every org gets on way more calls than they need. So yeah, please help your own org reduce calls.
There are a couple of points there. Okay. First is, I think, relating to...
Maybe you want to keep it on the previous. Yeah.
So I'll give you a couple of context. Like, I was very lucky. I worked with Russians for 6 months and we didn't know each other's language. Right. Which is why I wrote a whole game on Confluence and literally through comments.
Right.
Like I wrote this.
It's called constrained creativity.
Yeah. So that's how I learned. But God knows it's so difficult to even mentor PMs that I'm mentoring on this. Right. Because one, they don't have the constraints to actually take the pain to learn this craft. So that's one part. Right. Second and more difficult part is a lot of us, and again coming back to all this conditioning of 20 years, a lot of folks do not want to understand written documents. Right. They don't want to read. And what I do is I write out the PID, I draw it out in a Miro with exact, if else, and then I have to walk them through it. And then push them to ask questions and post comments there. So there's the other side as well.
I know what you're going to say, but please. Yes.
Because we are already in tank warfare, there are things which you can train for and things which you have to hire for.
Yes, absolutely.
And the intent to read is probably one thing which you cannot train for.
Agency is very hard to train. Like it can be absorbed and people can learn it, but you can't teach it very easily.
No, how to read versus making it worth reading and making that a default when there is an option. If you can pull that off, please remind me, because New York Times is still less valuable than TikTok and Instagram.
No, he's saying, I think he's talking about, yeah. All right. But anyone else, any thoughts on, yes, Shobit, please. Yeah. Yeah, so it does come down to articulation, which is a
want to repeat,
yeah, so what Shobit is saying is that it comes down to being able to write so that other people understand, right? Articulation, and it is a difficult skill. But again, it's a hire versus teach problem. Honestly, like if you're predominantly working with a team that is unable to articulate in written fashion, then sometimes it's worth spending or investing time, money into that. Right.
It gets very boring to read user versus
True.
Taking a slow read approach to this.
Correct.
Where you take like the whole journey, why do they do that and all those shit, right? So like what I generally train people for first is we get them like a storytelling course or something like that. So the first few written documents or artifacts that they produce, they need to be a story of it. Like even
great example.
Yeah.
Great example. Also, something Pramod said earlier, very relevant here, that you don't have to get stuck up on only writing, for example, right? I wrote written here because that's a dominant form of communication, but you don't have to get stuck on writing alone. There are other ways of passing ideas along. Loom we shared, right? So you don't that's the idea. We are too stuck with something that was passed on to us, and we don't deliberately set up systems that aid us, right, in collaboration. So I agree with Shobit. I think great point.
I think one point I would like to add about the writing. I mean, I look at if you have to write a document at work, and if you must have a really strong reason to write a document at work. The way I look at it is I more or less start with bullet points. I said this is blah, okay, this is working, this is not working, this is how it goes, how about we do this? And then if required, evolve it into maybe paragraphs and then evolve it into maybe like a narrative and stuff like that. So I think you should keep the bar as minimum as possible. And I think writing in our day-to-day knowledge work is very different from, grammar and composition we were taught as like in anywhere, right, in education. I think that is very different. You don't have to persuade anybody, you're not arguing a case, right? You're presenting the facts. I think we get a lot of anti-patterns, right? Like if you pick up a magazine or a newspaper, sometimes I notice you have to have a dramatic headline, you have to start with a fancy anecdote, like, hit, the reader hard. I think all of that are anti-patterns when you're communicating at work. Start with the simplest things, blah, 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 this is this. Where do we go from here? I think we don't have to go for complex narratives and things.
And actually drama is counterproductive to your good problem solving.
Absolutely.
The higher the drama, the lower the quality of conversation, because the stakes increase.
Right. Well-written one-pagers have done more to business than 10-page PRDs, right? With the exception of UI building. I think UI building is where going into detailed specifications matters a lot. I think Gopal can probably share more.
No, I think that the thing that people go is you go from illiterate to Mark Twain as a binary thing.
Correct. It's not.
That's not how it works. Like, you don't need to produce a work of prose that will win some award the way the New York Times tries to do and fails.
Correct. Absolutely.
Like, all you need, you had a tweet of a piece of paper with like 6 words on it.
Right.
That conveys more information than 8 pages of nonsense. Like,
correct.
If you give me 8 pages of nonsense, obviously the was going to read this crap.
Right. Exactly.
But all you need is a piece of paper, a pen. We all have cameras at a decent.
Absolutely.
Take a picture of that and post it.
Right.
So I think you don't have to go like even with video, right? Like I took out my phone and did a selfie recording or whatever, and then there's like Avengers.
Correct.
It's not this or that. You can
Correct. I totally agree. I think so. This is less controversial. Somewhat. There's a lot of agreement. Let's move. All right. Mentorship is complicated when remote.
How many shall we club the last two and put into
the how many people agree with this? Mentorship is complicated when remote.
I think I'll also.
Okay. All right. This group doesn't agree. Nice. Okay, because a bunch of colon folks here. Remote only makes it different, not harder. We'll come to it. This one of my favorite. Sometimes people have these things. Oh, remote just doesn't work for me, right? And they think it's a preference. What I'm saying is it's not really a preference, right? People's preferences about remote or distributed are not actually about remote and distributed at all, right? And we are now getting into core people issues. Generally speaking, preferences about remote work are to do with how sorted you are in your life. Do you exercise every day? Do you have friends? Do you have trust with your coworkers? And some of the other issues. They are never really about remote and distributed, because look, people don't really care whether you're remote or distributed. Everybody wants to get work done, feel good about, get intellectual satisfaction, make money, right? Remote and distributed, they don't feature in our career trajectory, in our long-term thinking, right? They are just different modes along the way. But we attribute too many things to it, right? I call remote as the most misattributed malady in work culture. We tend to attribute so many things to, it's happening because we are remote. It's happening because we are distributed. No, man, like you have bad coworkers, right? Live with the fact, right? So, which is why I say a lot of, and it goes back to mentorship as well. the thing is, you can absolutely mentor people remotely as well. I have done it all my life. I have received mentorship all my life. Like the maximum mentorship I've received is by reading Peter Norvik's blog post. I've never even met that guy, right? But he wrote 5 articulated blog posts, one about Sudoku solver, that taught me more about programming than maybe like months of work did. And so, which is why my main claim is that remote only makes it a little bit different, and you have to approach it in a different way. I think we tried that a lot in Kolan. Raghav and Neha and Mehul can probably either bust me or support me. So like I said, you just have to, like I said, you have to be deliberate and set up those systems where that osmosis is possible. Remote pairing is a great way. People working together on the same thing at the same time. Again, cross-function collaboration, great way to quickly mentor people, right? Monthly check-ins, weekly check-ins, great way to offer mentorship. What happens is, in a lot of settings, people lack the agency, and we substitute being co-located for lack of agency, where you are trying to force their behavior or you're trying to make them behave in a certain way, and we misconstrue it for mentorship, right? Whereas mentorship is fundamentally about guiding and signals, feedback, etc. And so, which is why I call it the misattributed malady, is that we tend to attribute so many things to remote, whereas it's about something else, technically. Yes, Shobit.
So again, a random thing that I read somewhere, but basically, if you've ever learned from a book by yourself, that was just mentorship from somebody towards you.
Yeah.
So if anybody over here has learned by themselves with a book, like you basically agree that you can be coached by someone who's not present over there.
Absolutely. And like blog posts, books, open source work. I mean, so we have practically built our careers on open source, right? So many here, like if you raise your hand, if open source built your career. We built our careers based on open source. Some random dude somewhere in Norway was hacking in his parents' garage, and he wrote some code which I read, and some tubelet went in my head, right? So these things happen all the time in programming specifically. I can't speak of other functions with the same authority, but it happens all the time, right? And so it's possible in remote. There is enough evidence in the world that it happens way more in remote than in co-location. In fact, in co-location, you have to overcome different kinds of people problem, culture issues, all of those.
I think we have.
Anyway, I think Amir.
So I think, picking up a book and reading, we have learned it from Russell, right? So
you have the mic.
That is definitely there. But I think when you are coming to a professional life, even knowing that you can actually approach someone and discuss things and get some sort of guidance, that is something like basically, that is something learned, or that is something, if it is set up, then you are basically, onboarded to it. So
Correct.
If somebody, especially like I think you can get feedback from people who have got onboarded to work during the pandemic, did they realize that they can approach someone to basically discuss their issues or get some guidance? That's one thing. The other thing about remote is the empathy or that serendipitous encounters are like not happening anymore. Like either water cooler talk or just some sort of coffee encounter. So even if you don't have a relationship, how do you, like it's not about like a office setup of mentor and mentee. It's just about just meeting someone or looking over the shoulder and figuring out what they are doing and then approaching them to discuss that.
Just working together solves a lot of those problems, right? Several people learned a whole bunch of keyboard shortcuts that they never thought existed, just because they were watching me code remotely on a Zoom call, right? So these things are possible. Again, those things are attributed to company not doing those things and culture not being set properly, not because it's remote. It's because the leadership did not take the time to set things up, right? In a co-located fashion, somehow years of conditioning puts us into it, and we do it. So in that sense, you could say, fine, remote makes it more challenging because you have to do it now subconsciously. But hey, almost all the work we do is deliberate, right? So, which is why again misattribution is. I think Gaurav had something.
Can you make sure it's on when you pass the mic?
Yeah, I just have something to say.
Okay.
So to counter that, a lot of the examples which you gave, for example, water cooler conversation with a callback to serendipity, I could also make a case that this is an extrovert dividend. And there is tons of complaints on how Sutta breaks result into PRDs changing and promotions being decided.
Huge problem. Huge problem. It's a real problem.
So if I'm going to build a case against async, I will also, or remote in that case, I will also have to build a case against co-location, Sutta breaks, party outs, whatever you want to call it. And it's about trade-offs in that sense. Yeah.
Co-location is not inclusive. I'll stand on this hill. May not die on this hill. but it's not inclusive. It tends to attract a similarly culture, a little more homogeneous. If you're very homogeneous, be co-located. It's going to benefit.
I think maybe like speaking for Bangalore, it tends to attract people who can get there.
Really?
So, to counter your thing, what I would say is look at the open source model. One of my very first mentors was sitting in Spain while I was sitting in India and was like 5 years younger to me, and he was mentoring me. So in that case, there is no option. You have to be like, you have to do it remotely.
Yeah.
So it can be solved in that way as well.
Hacker News, great example, right? Like the ultimate tech serendipitous front page of the internet, right? You discover random things because somebody curates and puts it there. So yeah, anyway.
I think Twitter is a very good example. I've met tons of people. So I remember I was learning web dev from somebody who's mentoring me on web dev is 7 years younger to me. I can't imagine doing that in a real life setting, meeting them in a meetup and having the guts to ask them, hey, can you guide me on my roadmap for web dev?
It happens. Shobit has mentored me on so many things, and he's way younger than me.
Form, and I don't fear anymore what I'm saying.
I think we had one comment, and maybe we'll have to, like, in the interest of time, we'll have to wrap it up.
So I think, I mean, you all have convinced me a lot more than I would have originally had my opinion. But at the same time, I think I sort of agree with what he said, which was that, I'll give you where I'm coming from, first of all, right? So probably now after this conversation, we are a lot more closer to async and co-located for the longest period. Right. Last 2 or 3 years, we've been mostly remote and mostly async, right. Except few maybe sprint meetings and whatnot, right? But my experience has been that the team did not catch up as fast as the earlier teams. Maybe there's differences, obviously. But one of the feelings I thought was that, so I think we tried a couple of things like, paired programming, etc. But it was not as sticky as what would happen when you're seeing people there. Or the speed of communication on Slack while typing was not as fast as what I can do over my as I'm speaking. Right. Or I couldn't nudge in when I wanted to very quickly when I'm visually there. Right? All those minor differences I felt makes it enough of a difference that causes problems. I think co-located and async might still work. I don't think I have a problem, and only because of these issues. But I agree that I think what Nirant was saying was 100% true.
So, okay, so let me ask this to both of you. What did you do about it?
So I think first things we tried to do some amount of pair programming. Right. It went on for a couple of months and then it sort of died for various reasons. Right? Maybe we didn't debug it enough. That's quite possible. Okay. Other things that we tried is we started having more structured documents to document some of the issues, and I even tried to put in practices, documents about what tools I use, etc., etc. And they're all going into. I think maybe the biggest problem is that we don't have a tool to easily find stuff. Maybe that is a real problem, right? Whereas, So
but let me. Amir,
so I'm very interested to know what tools you all use. Maybe that is.
I'll come to that. Yes.
I just wanted to add, right? Niran talked about extroverted, introverted nature. If you're extroverted and then take a Sutta break, I think it's more about the behavior, right? If you're extroverted and don't smoke, you'll still go for the Sutta break and not smoke. If you're introverted, you'll take a solo.
I think we have. No, I think this will get into contentious.
Look.
I think we should.
No. What I'm saying is, it's just more about.
Let's have this conversation in a chai break.
Yeah.
It's more about behavior, right? If you're introverted, doing remote is even going to be more challenging.
But Amir, bro, let me ask you. You teach generative AI to people. That thing is hard, right? Are you telling me like you can't figure out how to mentor people remotely?
I think we are talking about async remote.
Yeah. My thing is like if you, let's say after this conversation today, if you go home, sit down, immerse yourself 3-4 hours and try to come up with a system, you will come up with a system. I guarantee you. right? Perhaps you were not motivated enough to try it before, or you were reliant on existing systems to give that to you, right? But I refuse to believe that if you set out to solve this problem today in your team, with all the context you have, that you will be unable to solve it, right? I refuse to believe that.
I think you just go one slide back, because mentorship is complicated when I agree.
Okay, okay, right. And I'm saying this is false, right?
Yeah.
That's the...
See, it's complicated, you can solve it with a
Right.
lot of thought.
Okay.
And yeah, it is different. It's harder. It's not easier.
Okay.
So that's where we can actually.
Okay. Remote pairing and working together fixes a lot of that. I think in offline we can probably share some of the things we've been doing and how Gaurav gave a lot of, like, look, mentorship predates work culture, right? And ever since the advent of internet, people have been mentoring each other in the remotest corners of the world all along. Yes, so it doesn't make it harder. There is so much evidence of it, even in a workplace, right? Do you think Basecamp people don't get mentored? They are fully async, fully remote, and people level up from like 0 to open source maintainers in a matter of years, right? So it's not hard. Like, there is so much evidence of it being consistently being done, right? And if it's a little harder, it's a solvable problem, right? Very much a solvable problem.
I have a point here. One factor I feel we all are not looking at is that...
Yes, go for it, Amol.
Yeah. One factor we are not looking at is it's a point in time thing. Like, what you are thinking of as remote and async is relevant for you today. If you train your company or have a set of discussions where you become more comfortable with each other, the same thing will become easier.
Yeah,
now, that's...
Sorry to
Sure.
interject you. What I'll add to that is, if you are really coupled to how you do mentorship, you're always going to find changing your style hard. So if you look at the outcomes and the expectations of mentoring, it's not hard. But if you are coupled to how you've been doing things in a different world, in a different context, then obviously just by virtue of being it different, it makes it harder, right? Two different bridge versus hearts. If you're playing cards, you played bridge all your life, suddenly you're playing a different game, it's going to be hard for you. It doesn't mean that game is inherently subjectively harder. It's only hard for you, right? It's not inherently harder. Right? And it's only hard for you because nobody is probably given you that exposure. And with structures in place, it's very easily doable. Right?
Okay, right? Like, you are saying that, hey, you can exercise more agency.
Exactly.
That's the essence of all of these points, that yes, these might be slightly different, but then you can exercise more agency and get it sorted, and don't think of them as hard constraints.
Right.
I think that's what you're trying to say here.
Yep.
Right. I think the 100%, 0%, like he said, right? Like, there's a range of possibilities. It's like not binary.
Cool. I think Shobit had something.
What I was basically saying was, how do you really receive mentorship? It's either you see other person play around with their tools, around with their work or the output, right? So for the stuff that we do, I'm specifically talking about developers right now, okay? So the stuff that we do is generally available. The output is available on GitHub or whatever, right? Like the pull requests and everything I can directly see. And the second way that you receive the mentorship is feedback on the work that you do. Again, that thing is not something that requires you to be in person, because generally feedback it's going to be on your pull requests or on whatever thing that you have, right? Except for the verbal cues that are also available in the mentorship phase if you are like co-located. I really don't see, what extra thing, what is that extra point that you're saying probably? In terms of mentorship.
Yeah, very specifically, process-driven mentorship will always be challenging in a remote. If you're very process-driven in your mentorship, or do this, do that, watch me do it, then you're always going to find it very hard to... And again, honestly, even with remote pairing, some of that, that's why I was saying sync will negate your co-location problems. If you're in a sync setting, you can negate some of those problems as well. But that's why process-heavy mentorship is always going to be a little bit tougher. And it's also slower and less effective. There is research, if you seek, go and read. There's plenty of research on mentorship aspects. So which is why, like, signals and outcome. Basically, you can think of mentorship as a parallel to learning, where you collect things, and when you're self-learning, you connect the dots In mentorship, someone else helps you connect those dots, right? They don't necessarily have to do it the same way that we are used to, right?
I think we've kept those two for the last because these are really tough things to tackle. And I think looking at the amount of conversation, maybe we need another session where somebody talks about mentorship in the context of remote can itself be like a session sometime.
No, but honestly speaking, all you have to do is look at meetups, conferences, and user groups all over. There's so much mentorship there, man. Like so much evidence. Like I'm not kidding. Like just the fact that open source is a great example for this. So many communities, they evolved around the whole idea of remote mentorship. Like Eric Raymond's hacker essay, great example. Yes, yes, please.
Do you have a mic that we can get to you?
Mentorship on functional areas. Right. That's harder, and that's where the osmosis comes in.
What do you mean by functional areas?
For example, anyway, you are working on a tech where some product related decision planning, everything comes on. So tech mentorship is not harder, but at the same time, when the function is added into that one, which is a domain specific function, any new person or coming into coding, getting into the functional ladder, that's where osmosis comes in.
You mean like software
we
engineering,
need
but now in the context of, let's say,
how to break the remote to how to ensure that a person who is remote, who can understand get the enough functional knowledge to tackle the remote, tackle more async communication. This is where I face most of the issues.
Which is why remote and async are not related, right? And remote and sync solve this issue. That's why the whole spectrum, right? So remote and sync, like pair programming, solve this to a large extent.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Like mentorship is not about your day-to-day, right? Like you want to maybe talk to somebody, have a call, like pretty much, right? Like yeah. Sorry, you had a point.
Okay. Yes. Yes.
I'm very interested to know the tools you all use.
Okay.
Maybe I'm taking an extreme example here. Meaning, once upon a time, our team used to run for marathons, right? And used to go train in the morning.
Right.
Something like this is extremely hard to do in a remote world, right? Because the cohesion was because we all came up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go run, right? Okay. And that went to the extreme that as a team, then we had people who were running ultra marathons.
Sure,
right?
sure.
Now, those kind of things are extremely hard now.
Yeah,
right?
but I have a different badminton group I play with every day, right? They are not the same as my work colleagues.
Got it. Okay.
I think you mentioned like
but
work
maybe,
can't be the
so
social
maybe,
mixer part anyway. Like,
that is one thing. And second is, I think also, I think, for example, if you are making an assumption and Nirant is saying that only certain people can achieve, I mean, the certain kind of skill set they are better good at, right? You need to hire for that, right? Then maybe what you're saying, I might agree with. But if you take the hypothesis that anyone can be trainable, and now if you need that, you need to put in lot more effort, in which case I think it becomes harder. Now if you say that anyone can be trainable, and it can be done in a remote async way, that I think makes it harder.
I'll add only one little thing. The anyone needs to be qualified. I'm not saying anyone meaning random sample of the populace. Tech is already a very heavily self-selected sample, right? And so within tech, if you're sampling, it's not like it's possible. Like it's like there is evidence. Like there is I'm not making it up. Like there is evidence. Yeah. But what do you mean by tools? Like what tools? Like for example.
So, for example, I'll give examples of things I thought did not happen in Osmosis, right? So, for example, on command line, I'm just giving a real example. So, command line tools, for example, the proficiency my team members would have, right? Because they'll see all of us doing it so quickly every day, day in, day out. I do it in one pair programming. If they're really eager, they might have saw me using FZF or Control R or whatever, right? And they would have immediately picked it up, or how I organize my laptop, or whatever that may be.
So this is a tenure issue and not really a medium issue. So if you're doing remote pairing for a while, people pick things automatically because you can't cover 15 years of work experience in one working session, right? You're not going to use all your commands on the single day. Sometimes you are going to use them on some other day. Sometimes you'll have some. So basically, tenure fixes these problems, right? So basically, deliberate habits where you are doing remote pairing, you have systems, and then doing it for a period of time. A lot of these things are fixed.
Also, I think one of the things that we have tried is developer productivity is a really important part of being able to function really well, right? And I think these things can be taught intentionally. If your engineering culture really cares about, getting people familiarized with their tools, you can teach them about Git. You can get them really, really familiar with their tooling in like say a few deliberate sessions, and you can record them and keep them forever. That can be part of your onboarding.
Correct.
So I feel like that all of these things can be taught. We just assume that they can only be taught by seeing them from
Absolutely.
outside.
Great point.
But I think building them intentionally as part of your culture. And also like I think one of the things that I keep hearing is what happened in the last 3 years was work from home during a pandemic. It was not remote.
I know.
And there's a huge difference between the two.
People were uncertain about there being a world 2 years down the line. So just strike out the last 2 years from your memory. Because it's a very different world, man. Like not being able to go out of your house, it's a very different feeling, right? If you're having problems in work because some family member got COVID, like it's a genuine
social life.
It's a whole different problem altogether. So we can't attribute COVID-induced problems to work cultures.
And also people's homes were not set up for work.
Correct. Like, we had to do it in such a short notice. Working from home is a whole different ballgame altogether. Like I'm not talking about work. Today we have basically completely stayed away from work from home because it's a whole different set. Not everybody has the capacity and means to work from home, which is why we're specifically talking about remote and distributed. Let's talk about work from home another. But like I said, COVID introduced a lot of bad, I would say, again, attribution probably. We did a lot of things purely because, there was a pandemic at large, which would not have otherwise done. So anyway, I think Gopal,
two things. I think regarding mentorship, there's a difference between training and mentorship. Training can definitely be done in 8 million ways, right? That's not a problem. Mentorship, the issue is mostly one of how much of the picture are you seeing when you're mentoring someone, right? Like, yeah, in theory, you can sit halfway across the world, but if you don't know what's happening in their life outside of that mentorship session, you may be thinking, hey, this person is struggling because they're not able to get it or whatever, but it might be because their dog passed away. Right? And this particular type of conversation where you get to know the whole person is a lot harder to do when you don't get a chance to have a coffee with them or share a meal or go somewhere and just talk about whatever RCB winning comprehensively for once and this kind of nonsense, right? The second thing is, I think it sort of hit on 2-3 points of even the mode of the fidelity of the communication and stuff. With async, I think we have to separate bandwidth into 2 parts, right? Latency and throughput.
Correct.
Async increases your throughput, but almost necessarily reduces your latency.
Right.
And it depends what you value. Right? If you are sync and co-located, your latency is extremely low, but you pay for it in throughput.
Right.
Whereas if you're async, you can do a lot of things, but any one of them will not get done particularly fast.
Correct. Yeah, I think that's a very nice articulation. I like that. Cool. Yeah, I mean, look, relationship building, mentorship and relationship building are intricately related, and some parts of relationship building are always going to be a little bit harder to do remotely, and like I'm not denying that, but the thing is, mentorship can happen in that slice. If you eliminate it, can happen in other ways also, right? So anyway, I think that's this is the last one, I guess. That's it.
I think we had a Q&A, but that's probably covered.
Cool. So thank you.
Yeah. So yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so we have the menu until 7:30. Any other discussions, like anything other than this? Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah. So,
shall we close the online?
No, it's fine.
Or can we continue?
Sure. Let's do a few questions, and after that we can decide.
I just wanted to know your thought on the whole, I think the last 3 to 4 years. So I was also leading a team, and that's when the pandemic hit, and there was no other option than to basically work remotely and a bit of async, whatever.
Right.
And there was, like at the start, there was a lot of basically unknown and a lot of doubt. But soon things were sorted out, and everybody was like very excited because they were saying time on commute, they had like the comfort of home, and that went on for say about 2 years when things started to normalize. But then people were like very combative, saying, "Oh, we will never go back to office." Now this year, starting this year, companies are calling everyone back to office. Some companies forcefully. So how do you see the whole thing? Like that everyone was a little doubtful, then they got comfortable, and then they preferred it, and they were like little
Okay, cool. So I'll repeat his question. Basically, I think Amir is asking my opinion or Pramod my opinion on the whole sentiment about working from home and then being compelled to come back to office, right? I think fundamentally remote work and all work is about the co-workers. If you like your co-workers, you would love working with them co-located. If you like your co-worker, you love working with them geographically distributed, right? If you have a good camaraderie, nothing else will stop you, right? And this is a great example of why remote really works and why some of the problems are completely different people problems, right? But at the same time, people problems are real. Conditioning is real, right? So how do you get past it? My personal answer to that is like deliberate practice and setting structure and process in place. And about the business question, somebody, this is not my original thought, but I read it somewhere. At any point, you can build three things. Out of these three things, you can only build two. It's like a cap theorem. Out of these three, you only build two things. First is your product. Second is your customer base. And third is your company. Out of these three things, at any point, you can only build two. Right? So if the companies are busy building customer base and product, then they're not going to build a company. When I say build company, that means pay attention to people, their productivity and whatnot. And at earlier stages, your priorities are different. And as you grow bigger, you don't need to really, Google doesn't need to build a customer base, right? So they can focus on building company and product, etc. as an example. So depending on which stage the company is in, the priority of the leadership might be different. And it's up to everybody to personally decide whether they are okay with that priority or not, right? If your company is in a space where it can't afford to really pay attention to people so much, you have to live with it, right? Or change the situation. There's not much you can do about it unless maybe you are the co-founder or you're in a position to change that. So people don't have a lot of control on those aspects. But what you have control on is like your fundamental agency, right? It comes back to like individual agency, and it has been one of my mentorship themes have been like you have to develop a little bit of agency. Right? It also like I think PM in that way is a very curious role. Fundamentally, PM role attracts people with higher agency because you have to figure things out, etc. Right? Talking about good PMs. Anyway, no flame war. But what I'm saying is, let's say if you're an engineer or data scientist, you have to have a say in what you are going to work on. And if you don't, then that's a suboptimal way of living, especially for knowledge workers, right? Someone else can't always tell you what to do. And if you're in a spot where someone else is constantly telling you what to do, like that's not a very good place to be in, right? You want to be in a place where you put work on your own plate. It doesn't have to be 100% of the work. It can be like 10%, 20%, whatever. That is where the agency factor comes in. And same applies to remote work and collaboration patterns as well. That the team has to have some agency on how they do things. And then you can evolve those patterns.
So, I think one way I am looking at this particular, how will it play out in next couple of years, right? Given what has happened in the last 2-3 years. I don't have a prescriptive answer as to how it ought to, but what I'm looking for is, will there be certain areas where people will pull off success being remote plus async, wherever on the spectrum? Will there be certain areas where they can't, and what can we learn from that? Like, for example, obviously if you can do like a distributed team, right? Like you can hire talent from anywhere, right? And if you go across time zones, obviously you can hire talent from across the world, whatever, labor arbitrage and things like that, right? Like, so given the trade-offs, like now, where will the trade-off translate into competitive advantage? And who are the kind of people who will be able to do that is something I am keeping an eye out on. And maybe for general, like we can, now at least we have those choices to make, right? Like if you prefer this, maybe this is the domain or market you have to play in, right? If you prefer this, maybe this is the domain. Like I said at the very start, right? Like this remote async also has an interplay with your company's specific business model and your software methodology and your, how you interact with customers, right? Like now at least we can bifurcate those. Earlier, everything had to operate every company operated in the same way, no matter what these other parameters were. But now we have those differentiations may play out over the next 3 years. At least maybe as people looking for work, you have those options to choose from, but that doesn't mean that every domain this will work. Right, you have to be a little smart about that.
There are two things to think about. One is what DHH calls knee-jerk policies. where one person behaves bad and you end up making a policy that punishes everyone else because you somehow think, oh, what if this guy did or this lady, someone else will also do it. The thing is, nobody's going to do it. One person did it, fine, like, move on. But people are not comfortable with the fact that one person took advantage, now everybody will. So you end up making policies. Number two, people try to scale trust at an organizational level, which in my personal opinion is impossible. You have to scale trust in team level and smaller pods. So if you make a policy, okay, entire org works from office, it makes no sense to me, right? You have to do that in a smaller sections of, if you're running a big org, you have to let the smaller level, other level leaders figure out what works for their pod, because the trust only scales to that level, right? And it's very hard to work in a remote team that does not trust each other, because then you are going to constantly, hey, where are we? Are you working on this? What did you do last week? Right? Elon's famous words, like biting words. Like nobody should ever be in a position where someone else asks them that, right? It should be evident. But like I said, so that trust is very hard to scale at an org level, especially after a certain size. 1,000 people is like where I've seen that it really flips over. 80-20 law kicks in. So you have to scale trust and your remote and work culture policies in smaller levels. And if you try to do at the org level, it becomes a mess, right? But the thing is, companies are not set up to do it in the smaller levels. Let's say Infosys, 100,000 people. The legal team will never sign off on anything that operates on anything smaller than say 1,000 people. A policy that applies to 1,000 people, they'll never sign off on it, for example, right? For various valid legal reasons potentially. And so the companies that have not done this organically, they are always going to find it extremely hard to adapt. Like I don't know how Infosys can go remote, for example, right? Like I'm completely clueless, right? But how Colon can go remote, like I know, right? How, let's say, Target's one specific business division can go remote, very much possible, right? Can Target as an entire company go remote? No idea, probably not. But let's say your business unit, Amul's business unit, can you go remote? Very much possible. So that context is missing in all of these work from home or come back to office mandates, is that somewhere that scale mismatch is happening. And it'll continue to happen. There's no way around it, the way I see it. Cool.
I think one thought I would add or maybe ask is, I don't understand this come to office 3 days a week, 2 days a week. I mean, that's something being tried. I really don't know, like, how would you choose those 2-3 days? Who comes on what day? I don't know. Like, have people thought about it deeper? Like,
That is also a gateway to another kind of hell. I will promote people who I see in the office.
no, I'm saying, how do you even decide which those days are and which team comes on what day? Like, what happens?
Monday and Friday you work from home.
No, we've done this.
Okay.
It's very simple. The day the football pitch is available, everybody is in office.
Yeah, see?
Okay,
Great
this
policy.
is the number one criteria. Whatever day you get the booking on the football pitch at 7, that day everybody shows up.
Amazing policy. That's what I call a people first policy, where you're deliberately thinking about the goodwill of your team.
No, you choose a completely arbitrary metric so that nobody can complain.
Yeah, or for example, one thing that I insist on is I'm doing one-on-ones, I want to do them in person, whenever possible,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
Not every time, but
Okay.
whenever possible.
Okay. Great
So
policy.
I'll stack 3 one-on-ones in a day and say that day everybody's here.
Okay.
Right? And we universally communicate, if you have a one-on-one with me, I better see you. If you don't have a one-on-one with me, do what you want. Right? So, yeah, saying Monday, Wednesday, Friday for some ridiculous reason, yeah, okay, that's silly. But I think if you have reasonably intelligent people, they will figure this out on their own.
I think that is the key. Agency and reasonable intelligent people, right? You can do with anything, right? As long as you decide that you want to solve this problem together.
This is another solution that people talking about it for 90 minutes.
No, I think there's an important point here about homogeneity. So think of it this way, right? So in games we say something like this, like a game for everybody is a game for nobody.
Right.
And your point on let smaller units decide for themselves actually lies in that. Because in a smaller unit you have more homogeneity or more cohesion.
Shared
And
context.
there's shared culture, shared understanding.
Shared context, yeah.
Shared context. There's also this whole mindset around, hey, I'll compromise for the other people in my team and stuff like that.
Right.
Now, when you start thinking about that, it is easier to make a decision which is almost agreeable for most people.
Yeah.
And that is where, that homogeneity comes in. Otherwise, it's like India, right? I make a rule in India for some tax evasion, and that rule will be a big headache for 5 crore people. and useful for 95 crore people. So that's why at scale, a lot of these problems are not even solvable. They have to be contextualized to smaller user segment, which is more homogeneous.
Yeah, correct. And this compromise, I think, for example, DevOps teams understand is very well, right? I can't do on-call this week. Can somebody else fill in for me? And let's say Mehul did on-call last week, but he's still do it for me because maybe I'll do it for him another time. So these things, in a smaller team, these things are very much possible, which is why like trust only scales up to a certain level. Cool. Any other thoughts? Otherwise, we'll close the live stream. All right. Thank you again. I hope you enjoyed and learned something new.
The very fact that there were so many conversations happening, means that you touched a nerve.
Yeah. All right. Great. Oh, wait. I had somebody, there's a Slack group. Anybody from Remote Indian here? Okay. So there was a Slack group, I posted it, and somebody was asking me that, hey, will this talk be recorded? Will this talk be async? Right? So I told him, like, look, when pilots talk about the cool things of flying, they don't bring their aeroplanes. Right? So anyway. This guy is really stuck on tools. Let's get him his tools.
For this particular talk, I'm an ideal customer in the sense that we are forced to be.
Don't have tools. Hello.